Hey folks, this is Jacky, and I'm here with Matt, who is our founding principal engineer at Tiger Data, who is now leading the AI engineering efforts. Today, I decided to take some time from Matt's busy schedule to talk to him about something new that we're releasing called prompt templates. One thing that we noticed when we've been building with AI and working on production use cases is that frequently AI and LLMs and even people themselves are not finding the right information when doing implementation on their databases. And we had decided that we're going to launch something called prompt templates, which condenses years of production information about building great database schemas and tables into reusable prompt templates that can be consumed by AI agents and large language models. And Matt is the person that is leading these efforts. So Matt, do you want to just give yourself an introduction and talk about really quickly what prompt templates is?
Yeah, so I'm one of the engineers here at Tiger Data. We've been doing a lot of experimental work here about how to make databases work better in the age of AI and LLMs. I say experimental, I really mean that because I think nobody really has the answer to this throughout industry. So I think it's actually a very exciting, very intellectually interesting and challenging problem to solve. So yeah, I've been kind of involved in a lot of these experiments that we're doing and trying to figure out what's the best way to expose data to both agents and humans.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting topic into context engineering, which is something that we've been hearing a lot more of. So you guys have been building this thing called prompt templates. Can you give the audience a brief description of what a prompt template is and how it is used in their AI engineering or LLM coding workflows?
The basic idea is actually just to give context to the LLM. So you could think of, let's say you're using a coding agent like 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏𝗃 or 𝗥𝗲𝗃 or whatever. You give it a question. Now, if you just give it a question, it will use pretty much the training data of the model to answer that question. But you could also give it additional information, which is like what people now refer to as context engineering. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? Most often when people talk about context engineering, it's as part of a RAG pipeline or something where you search for the context, you get it, you return it. But what prompt templates or like what I like to call them guides are kind of end-to-end documents that explain an entire workflow to the LLM. A good example from our work is like we have a guide on how to design a Postgres schema, right? But like when a person asks to design a table or an index or something like that, there's a whole lot of context that you could give the LLM to help it to do that more optimally, right? You could think of it as a long piece of text that you give to the LLM anytime that you want it to perform a task. So MCP prompt templates, which are part of the MCP spec, these kind of guides that you have to invoke explicitly. We can get into this a bit later, but I don't think you necessarily need to invoke them explicitly, and that's why I call them guides. But they're just a long wall of text to help the LLM.
What problems triggered your team to start building prompt templates?
Quite frankly, the problem is that we saw that LLMs, when used as coding agents through stuff like Cursor and Claude Code, they are magical in many ways, but they're also limited in some ways. And we saw them give less than great answers to questions where we think our users really need better answers. And so we went around and tried to really figure out how to make them give better answers to users, how to measure it, which is a whole other problem in itself, and how to really replicate the results so that our users have an easier time configuring their systems. I think in general, configuring a database is a very hard problem for engineers, humans, agents, otherwise.
Yep.
And I don't think it should be in a way. So the goal here is to make it a kind of more streamlined, more easier, so that people avoid the foot guns that often occur when you configure and use a database.
I'm curious, how do you feel is different about purely documentation, which is how currently LLMs consume additional context about a code base, which is not part of their training data? How's documentation different from guide/prompt templates?
I think in a few ways. One of them is that documentation is often very technical API documentation about the particulars of a particular API call, right?
Yeah.
And so they don't describe an entire workflow for you. They only give you answer to a specific thing, right?
Correct.
And that's also kind of how they're used by these tools. They're searched for a particular thing, and the thing that's included in the context is only the result of a search, or the
Correct.
top 3 or the top 10, but it's not like an entire recipe, if you will. Like you wouldn't use this to give a recipe, right?
Yeah, that's a really good example. It's like, you are given the nutritional benefits of carrots, oranges, bananas, but if you ask an LLM to create a dish, it will infer what it thinks is the best way to create that dish, but a prompt template/guide is like a recipe. It gives you step-by-step, methodical, battle-tested information on how to build a delicious, nutritious dish.
Exactly. And like when you are, as a human, consuming a recipe, you don't want step 1, 2, and then 8 and 9, right? You want the entire thing so you can make sense of it kind of end to end. And I think that's one of the major differences between documentation and guides, is that guides are meant to be consumed kind of in the one shot, if you will.
Yeah. Can you break down specific examples that you've encountered where prompt templates helped or can prevent production issues?
Yeah, so let me just continue with this prompt templates for schema design, right? So in this model training, LLM model will have encountered much more SQL than any human has ever encountered. It's read all of the SQL possible, the good, the bad, the ugly. But the problem is, it's encountered all of that SQL, right? And it doesn't necessarily know what is good, what is bad, and what is ugly. A simple example is in Postgres, there are features that everybody who is a Postgres expert knows not to use, to stay away from. And yet, there's a surprising amount of SQL that contains that. A good example is the money type, right? Nobody should be using the money type. Everybody should be using numeric with 2 decimal points, right? But you wouldn't necessarily know that because that's kind of, the money type is still in there. I don't know why, but it's a 50-year-old copay, so you can imagine there are a lot of these things.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different levels of quality in terms of blog posts about best practices for Postgres, and they may be written by people that have never built a production Postgres before, but they just said the money operator is what you should use as opposed to the numeric operator.
And that's another good point, right? There's a lot of blog posts about this.
Yep. A lot of slop.
But a lot of slop, a lot of good blog posts too.
Yes.
But the problem is that good blog posts, they are written to be interesting to humans.
Yes.
And that means that all kinds of extraneous information about there, all kinds of analogies, cat memes, what have you, right?
Someone's life story.
Someone's life story, why did they get into Postgres? How did they get into Postgres? All this kind of stuff, which quite frankly is necessary for humans because we have certain limitations in our concentration, our attention, our interest, nobody wants to actually read a recipe. Everybody wants the recipe to be like, hey, I went to Italy and my grandma's grandma wrote this, right? The problem is that for LLMs, all of that extraneous information is A, expensive, because context space is expensive. B, it slows the system down, because the bigger the context, the slower the result. And C, it confuses the LLM, right? And even more advanced LLMs, if they hear enough cat memes associated with Postgres, they might think that cat is a data type, right? And they're just not. So, and so I think the type of content that you want for humans and the type of content that you want for AI is very different and needs to be written differently.
I think there's also two other points I'm thinking of where having guides written specifically for LLMs helps, which is one, despite the best LLMs today, they are still not the best at making good decisions. And good decisions often come from domain knowledge by teams, by people that have actually implemented it, people that have worked with customers to see what works and what doesn't. And I think the prompt templates that we're releasing today are based on these battle-tested scenarios that we have gone through ourselves building databases for decades as well. And so, yeah, one is just LLMs aren't very good at making good decisions, no matter how state-of-the-art the LLM is. And the second is that LLMs lack context on production use cases and scenarios, which are often hidden inside organizations. Even within like Tiger Data, we may not have all these scenarios written down because it's just in our heads. And so we literally extracted this data from our engineers, our solutions architects, our support folks, which leads to the next question I want to ask you, which is how do you systematically extract this domain production battle tested knowledge from various teams? So engineering, solutions, support, even from our executives, which have been here since the beginning, helping customers.
Well, I don't know if you want any information from the executives. I kid.
Definitely not from Mike or Ajay.
I mean, look, there's no systematic answers here. You need to ask people and hope that they tell you. That's really what it comes down to. So like in developing these prompt templates, I just kept on pinging people on Slack, asking them to look at it, give me their experiences, etc. The other thing I would say, kind of going back to your thing about LLMs making decisions, I also don't think that these decisions are necessarily like objective truths. I think one of the advantages actually of these guides is that they're opinionated.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're opinionated in a way that reflects my biases, the team's biases, but at the end of the day, it injects something human almost kind of into this process, and that it's our experience and our thought processes and our reasoning that will reflect in this.
Yeah, I really agree with you that the opinionated part of these prompt templates / guides is what really separates from documentation. Documentation oftentimes is as objective. I mean, the intent is to be as objective as possible. You let the burden of the decision making to the developer, and there might be little tool tips in documentation. You might even release engineering blog on how to best use this, but most of the time they are completely unopinionated. But prompt templates are very opinionated and based on just battle tested knowledge and just being on the field. So I think that's a really, really good point. Okay.
Yeah, some of these prompt templates, like the schema one, sorry, that's the one most prominent in my mind because that's the last one I wrote.
Yeah. Can you describe that schema design really quick? Because I don't think you explained kind of what you wrote in regards to this schema prompt template.
Yeah, so it's pretty much a list of rules of what to do when putting together a table. The data types to use, what kind of indexes to add, how to structure the indexes, how to think about normalization. All of these kind of things that maybe are database 101 in some sense, but there's a lot of nuances when it comes to actual systems like Postgres, right? Because what do you do in MySQL, Postgres, Oracle? They should all be very different. And actually what makes it hard is that the differences are kind of nuanced. And there's a lot of little details to remember. And so it's kind of all of those kind of details that I think would be useful to an LLM.
I'm curious for engineers and teams that want to build their first prompt templates. What are some things that you think they must include and things that they should not include for prompt templates? Basically, like I'm asking you for the best practices for building a good prompt template.
As I said, this is all experimental, so I don't actually think I know what the best practices are. Actually, we're all figuring this out. One thing I found useful is evals, to actually have a system that can systematically generate stuff using those prompt templates and see how it changes. It's not always obvious because it's more of an art than a science still, but personally I found that useful. I think if you're serious about making guides and prompt templates, you have to think about brevity because you have to think about the context length of what you're producing, right? So it's important kind of to step back and to think what are the kinds of things that you want to include. And the mental model I use, I think I already mentioned this, is the LM has seen a lot of SQL of all different kinds. And I'm kind of imagining, what if I encountered an engineer who has just seen lots of SQL, doesn't really have the experience to tell them what to do and what not to do? Like, what would I tell them? Obviously, like, I don't need to tell them what a select statement is. I don't even need to tell them, like, what an explain is. I don't need to teach them there's a thing called create table. That would all just waste context because that's in the training data. Like, what I need to tell them is, like, a list of do's, do nots, and kind of how to think about those nuances. And again, coming back to the comparison with the blog post, this prompt template would make a terrible blog post. Terrible. Nobody wants to, as a human, sit through and read, do this, don't do that. That's like being in school. Nobody wants to do that, right?
Yeah, I also noticed that for one of the recent prompt templates you're releasing, it actually has a scoring system. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so that is a prompt template where that's not a general Postgres one, that's one built for TigerData for hypertables.
Yep. Can you really briefly explain what hypertables are for folks that aren't super familiar with Tigerdata stuff?
Hypertables are a way of configuring tables in Postgres to use our extension timescaredb to store time series data. So it's really optimized for storing what we call time series data. Really, it's any data that is insert heavy as opposed to like update or delete heavy. So it could be anything from IoT data coming in with a timestamp to events, to financial data, to crypto, like all of these things fall into that bucket. So hypertables are for time series / insert heavy data because it's actually such a broad class of types of data that it could store. For example, it doesn't always need even a timestamp. it is not obvious to even experienced humans when you should use a regular Postgres table and when a hypertable would be useful. And so I have a guide for going through your Postgres schema and kind of picking out the tables that you should consider for being hypertables, and that scoring system is part of it, right? And I just thought that that would kind of guide Postgres in the right direction. And really, I wanted kind of to apply to it. This is important, this is less important, but still you should consider this. And that's kind of the top level signal I wanted to convey. And that's why I just created this scoring rubric.
And just for context for folks, because we are also releasing a MCP server that allows it to interact with our Tigr data database, can you explain just really quickly what access the MCP server needs for this hypertable prompt template, for example? Because it needs to understand your schema and tables and your use case prior to implementing the prompt template itself, the task inside.
Yeah, so actually the prompt templates are being released as part of a hosted, it's just open source, but a hosted MCP server that's open to the public that just has all kinds of documentation things about Postgres. It has all of the Postgres manuals, it has the Tigr manuals, we're going to be adding manuals for other Postgres related systems in the future as well. And this is totally free. Anybody can connect Claude with it and just get this information to help them with their Postgres.
I believe
system.
You can connect not just Claude, but basically any MCP compatible large language model. So you can use this in Claude Code, you could use it in Cursor, you can use it in basically any like thing that can connect to MCP server. Yeah, Codex. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so it actually doesn't need any access to your data or anything like that. One of these coding systems will just access this data when it needs additional information to complete a task. In this case, nothing is actually sent to the MCP server. As well, I should say we're also releasing a full MCP server for Tigr that allows you to execute actual SQL commands against your Tigr services, do that. And these prompt templates will also be part of that MCP server. And there you are sending in data. You are sending in SQL commands. But for this kind of open source thing that we are just providing for free to the community, publicly with no authentication, obviously nothing is being sent to us.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this release. So my next question for you is, how do you systematically measure whether a prompt template produces better implementations and results than simply just a LLM agent reading docs from, say, Context 7, which contains the documentation for Tigr data?
Yeah, so this was not a small part of this project. It took a little bit of thinking, because what you actually want to do is you want to evaluate the end-to-end result, right? So you want to evaluate how a person using a coding system what kind of results they will get. Which is difficult because it's really a conversation, right? Like, when you are coding using one of these tools, you're literally having a conversation with the agent. And so how do you evaluate conversations? I went back and forth trying to figure out how to think about this. I took a shortcut, I'll admit it, and I am right now evaluating kind of a one-shot result. But going through a coding agent, I picked Claude Code because it has a nice SDK, but pretty much what I'm doing is I'm giving it a prompt. For example, one of the prompts is about an IoT company that is getting readings, and I described the readings in the prompt. And I asked it to design a schema for me. And I actually have it output to the schema, so that's why it's kind of a one-shot, right? I give it all the information up front, and I ask it to produce a SQL, and then I could compare different answers, right? So kind of the control for this experiment I picked was Claude Code connected to an MCP server that had all of our docs, right? And then the experiment was Claude Code compared to an MCP server that had our docs plus the guides.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really just checking how much of a difference the guides make. And they're seeing what kind of sequel it give out. And for now, I'm just like looking through the sequel because I know what to look for, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And kind of getting a feeling for how good the results are.
Yeah.
I also, kind of as a work in progress, I wrote a rubric, and I plan to use LLM as a judge to compare them. Eventually, I didn't quite get there yet, but even just having comparisons I could get a gut feeling for was very important. And because it's the same exact question, and I have such a control set up, I could really kind of isolate the differences that I get.
And for the audience, we're going to have all of this stuff open sourced. It's going to be available on GitHub. We also have a accompanying blog post that describes all the stuff that we're talking about, including the evaluations on the prompt templates generated from purely documentation versus the SQL that's generated with these prompt templates. And we'll show you how we assessed how good the generated SQL is in comparison to those two. So if you want to check it out, we were going to have the links posted at the description of this video. So my final question.
Sorry, I forgot to give a very interesting insight I had doing the evals.
Ooh.
Actually, I kind of got from a blog post from 𝗥𝗲𝗃. So shout out to them. During the eval, I actually have it output feedback and criticism of my guide as part of the eval.
Yeah.
So actually the LLM could give me feedback about what were the guides, like even stuff about like MCP descriptions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that was actually also very useful.
Yeah, we're going to share that link to that guide as well for folks to read more into. Okay, my final question for you. This one is more forward thinking. So looking ahead in the next, 2 to 3 years, how do you see documentation evolving? Do you think traditional human documentation will become obsolete, or do we need a hybrid approach for different audiences and use cases?
No, it won't become obsolete in 2 or 3 years. I think, and not to get into the whole debate about how
it's pretty philosophical, right?
Exactly. I think software engineering as a job will change drastically. I think you will need human software engineers still, because of things like taste, of things like, higher level reasoning, architecture, stuff like this. And I think as long as you do have human engineers, you're gonna need human documentation. But I also think you will need agentic documentation as well. Now, maybe eventually LLMs will be good enough that you could take human documentation auto-generate agentic documentation, but I think quite frankly that will require very powerful models, much more powerful than we have now. And until then, there's going to be people like me with 2 decades of experience putting stuff down on paper.
Yeah, I think the whole thing with taste is something I've been hearing a lot in the AI community, which is, LLMs are really good at many things, but having good taste is something that it's debatable whether that can be trained into an LLM. Not just taste in, good engineering and good system design and architecture, but also good taste in like actual design, like UI, UX design. I think that's definitely something worth talking about, maybe in another podcast.
I'm not sure that humans have good design, actually.
Okay, that's a good point.
That's another story.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for your time in this. Really appreciate you sharing your insight on developing good AI engineering applications and how to use AI effectively. And as I've said before, we're going to have all the resources available with what we just talked about, what we launched at the description of this video. So that includes all the blog posts, the GitHub repo. We're also launching a directory of these awesome prompt templates that not just Tiger Data is releasing, but also other companies like Cloudflare and Figma, etc. These are just guides and prompts that they've written specifically for LLMs to ingest and digest. So thank you so much, Matt. Any final words for folks developing with AI agents?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Jacky, for having me on. Maybe not so much advice for people already developing, but for people who are skeptical, I would say try it and use it for a good month, and I don't think you'll go back. It's really an incredible technology if used well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. When I first got exposed to LLMs in 2023, I was just simply typing into ChatGPT, generate this little Excel script for me. And then, obviously I save it to a little bash file. And then later as the whole concept of agents came out, and I was like, what's agents? This is another buzzword that someone talked about. And then I downloaded Cursor, and then I started using it, and I was like, wait, this is pretty awesome. And then I was like, this is it. Cursor's the top. And then Claude Code comes out, and I'm like, wait, hold up. This is even better. Yeah, I highly recommend even if you're a skeptic or you're just someone just learning coding, highly recommend just playing with some of these tools and see what it can and cannot do, because I think that's the best way to gain context on what works and what doesn't work. So thank you again, Matt. Yeah, thank you everyone. Take care.